Chapter 8. Mars. Ideas that have been familiar to us from our very earliest childhood, which we have heard echoed on every hand and seen reflected in 1,000 ways, are tremendously hard to shake. We seem to love them as part of ourselves and cling to them in the face of the most overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So it often happens that men and women whose common sense and reason tells them that many of the statements of astronomy are as incredible as the story of Jack and the Beanstalk are still loath to part with their lifelong beliefs, and suggest that, after all, the modern theory must be true because astronomers are able to predict eclipses. But the Chaldeans used to predict the eclipses 3,000 years ago, with a degree of accuracy that is only surpassed by seconds in these days because we have wonderful clocks which they had not. Yet they had an entirely different theory of the universe than we have. The fact is that eclipses occur with a certain exact regularity, just as Christmas and birthdays do, every so many years, days, and minutes, so that anyone who has the records of the eclipses of thousands of years can predict them as well as the best astronomers without any knowledge of their cause. The shadow on the moon at the lunar eclipse is said to be the shadow of the Earth, but this theory received a rude shock on February 27, 1877, for it is recorded in M. Camille Flammarion's Popular Astronomy that an eclipse of the moon was observed at Paris on that date in these circumstances. Quote, "The moon rose at 5:29, the sun set at 5:39, and the total eclipse of the moon began before the sun had set." The reader will perceive that as the sun and moon were both visible above the horizon at the same time for 10 minutes before sunset, the shadow on the moon could not be cast by the earth. See diagram 31. Camille Flammarion, however, offers the following explanation. He says, quote, "This is an appearance merely due to refraction. The sun, already below the horizon, is raised by refraction and remains visible to us. It is the same with the moon, which has not yet really risen when it seems to have already done so." Here is a case where modern astronomy expects us to discredit the evidence of our own senses, but to believe instead their impossible theories. This atmospheric refraction is supposed to work both ways and defy all laws. It is supposed to throw up an image of the sun in the west, where the atmosphere is warm, and at the same time throw up an image of the moon in the east, where it is cool. It is absurd. When speaking of the measurement of the distance to Mars by Sir David Gill, in the same year, 1877, Sir Norman Lockyer described it as one of the noblest achievements in astronomy, upon which depends the distance and the dimensions of everything in the firmament except the moon." End quote. Evidently, a very big thing worthy of our best attention. The method which Sir David Gill used was the so-called diurnal method of measurement by parallax, which we have dealt with in an earlier chapter. He adopted the suggestion made by Dr. Halley and took the two observations to Mars himself, at Ascension Island in the Gulf of Guinea. The prime object of the expedition was really to find the distance to the sun, though we remember that had already been done by Encke 50 years before by the transit of Venus, which was to be done by first measuring the distance to Mars and, having found that, by multiplying the result by 2.6571, roughly 3, as suggested by Kepler's theory of the relative distances to the sun, Earth, and planets in this manner. Distance to Mars, 35 million times 2.6571 equals 93 million miles. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that, quote, "The sun's distance is the indispensable link which connects terrestrial measures with all celestial ones, those of the moon alone excepted, hence the exceptional pains taken to determine it," end quote, and assures us later that, quote, "The first really adequate determinations of solar parallax were those of Sir David Gill, result 8.8 degrees," end quote, and that his measures, quote, "have never been superseded," end quote. He found the angle of parallax of Mars to be about 23 degrees, which made its distance to be 35 million miles, and thus multiplied by 2.6571 showed the sun to be 93 million miles in the opposite direction. We realize that although the Sun's distance is said to be the indispensable link, it depends upon the measurement to Mars, so that this is more indispensable still. It is the key to all the marvelous figures of astronomy, and for that reason we will give it special treatment. The figure 35 million miles depends upon the angle of the planet, which is an angle of parallax. That is, the apparent change in the direction of Mars to the right or left of the star. X, star of reference, when both are viewed from the opposite ends of a baseline, which, in this case, is the diameter of the Earth. See diagram 15. Theory. If Mars is much nearer than X, and both are on a line perpendicular to the center of the Earth, an observer at A will see the planet to the left or to the east of the star, while B will see it to the right or west of the star. East and west are local terms and change with the position of the observer. The star of reference is presumed to be billions of miles away, so far away indeed that it is supposed to have no angle at all, so that the lines AX and BX are really parallel to each other and at right angles to the baseline, as shown in diagram 16. Even Mars is at a tremendous distance, so that the angle of parallax is the very small fraction of a degree by which the planet is less perpendicular than the star. Nevertheless, however slight the apparent displacement of Mars may be, if it is between the two perpendiculars AX and BX, the lines of sight AM and BM would meet somewhere at a point. So far, we have supposed A and B to be making observations at the same time, but Sir David Gill believed with Dr. Halley that he might take the two observations himself, the first from A in the evening and the second from B the next morning, allowing the rotation of the Earth to carry him around from A to B during the night, and these two observations would give the same result as two observations taken by A and B at the same time, Greenwich time. Accordingly, he took two observations at Ascension Island, one to his east and the other to his west, relying upon all the theories of his predecessors, failed to perceive that his second line of sight to the planet was on the wrong side of the perpendicular and diverged from the first. The fundamental principle of parallactic angles is unsound, while it is at the same time in conflict with quite a host of other astronomical theories, because the theories of atmospheric refraction, perpendicularity, geocentric parallax, and the aberration of light, combined with the use of sidereal time, all go to prove that every observation taken from the surface of the Earth to a star is exactly parallel with a line from the center of the Earth to the same star, and that B's line to X is parallel to that of A. Consequently, if Mars were on the line OX in diagram 15, as Dr. Halley presumed when he invented this method, it would be perpendicular to both A and B. Therefore, neither one observer or the other would see it at any angle at all. As shown in diagram 17, it is not possible for any observer on Earth to see Mars to the right or left of a star that is perpendicular unless the planet is in reality to the right or left of that perpendicular. No apparent displacement could occur, but the displacement must be physical, and so the theory of parallactic angles is exploded. Of course, there will be some ready to contend that Sir David Gill really did measure an angle. That is true, but it will prove to be an actual physical deviation of the planet from the perpendicular, which is a very different thing than an angle of parallax. But it was believed to be a parallactic angle. That is to say, it was supposed to be only an optical or apparent displacement due to the change in the position of the observer from A to B. Hence, a world of romance is built upon that little angle in this fashion. Angle of Mars, 23 degrees equals 35 million miles. 35 million times 2.6571 equals 93 million miles, solar. Parallax, 8.8 degrees, distance of the sun. The sun's diameter is 875,000 miles. Weight, XYZ pounds. Age, 17 million years. And will probably be burnt out in another 17 million years. 93 million times 2 equals 186 million miles, diameter of Earth's orbit. The distance to the stars must be billions of miles or even more. They must be a terrific size, and the Earth is only like a speck of dust in the Brobdingnagian universe, and etc., etc., etc. But we have not yet done with that angle, regarded as an angle of parallax and considered to be equivalent to just such an angle as a surveyor would use in measuring a plot of land. It was, of course, presumed that the two lines of sight converged so as to meet at a point 35 million miles away. See diagram 18. This, however, is a mistake, for the two lines of observation, when placed in their proper relations to each other, and in the order as they were taken, should be as in diagram 19, which shows that they diverge. We will prove this in diagram 20, a study of our earlier diagram 6, which gives a suggestion of a small section mapped out with dotted lines to indicate latitude and longitude in universal space, reveals the fact that 12 hours rotation of the Earth does not transfer the observer from A to the point B in space, because, according to Copernican astronomy, the Earth is not only rotating on its axis during those 12 hours, but also rushing through space in a gigantic orbit round the Sun at the rate of 66,000 miles an hour, or thereabouts, and so when the observer takes his second observation, he is something like 750,000 miles away from where he started. He is at latitude G in diagram 6. Now let's study diagram 20, which has been made as simple as possible in order to illustrate the principles involved the more clearly. The letter C is used in this diagram to take the place of G in the earlier diagram 6, because it is simpler to describe the movements of the observer by ABC than it is by ABG. All the principles and theories of modern astronomy have been carefully observed, and the parallelism of these lines is strictly in accordance with the theories of Greenwich. As I anticipate that in the course of time a battle royale will wage around this question of the measurement to Mars, I wish to make it quite clear that diagram 20 is designed only to illustrate the principles. It is to clarify the whole proceeding so that the layman can follow the argument. If the Royal Astronomical Society have any objection to make, I will be happy to discuss these questions with them in a manner worthy of the subject. The discussion may then perhaps be more refined indeed. I foresee a very pretty debate, wherefore I advise them that I know that Sir David did not really take his observations with a 12 hours interval as proposed by Dr. Halley, because it was impossible, but that he actually waited only 7.5 hours, hence my use of C in place of G in diagram 20. But that only elevates the discussion to a higher plane, while the principle and the net result remain the same. In the appointed time and place, I will discuss the actual practice if desired, but here I am dealing with the principle and talking to the layman and to the judge. Now let us get on with this diagram 20. The first observation is taken at A, and the second taken at C. It was evening when the observer was at A, but it is morning when he arrives at C, so that his east and west are reversed, the sun remaining fixed far below the bottom of this page. The sun is at the observer's west in the evening and to his east in the morning, while Mars is in the opposite direction to the sun. In this example, I have placed the planet exactly on the perpendicular from A to the star of reference, thus A Mars X. That is the starting point or first observation taken in the evening to the observer's eastward. 12 hours later, the observer is at C and sees the same star and the planet both to his west. But Mars is at this time not exactly on the perpendicular, but a very little, to the left of the star. The planet is not quite as much west as the star, that is to say, being to the left. It is to the eastward in the universal geography, and to the eastward of the perpendicular line CX. Now, if we were not particularly careful and had not this diagram to guide us, it would be quite natural to think that the first observation to the east should be on the left hand and the other west on the right, so as to face each other, so that any angle might appear, such as an angle of parallax, would be between the two perpendiculars to the star. In that case, they would seem to be shown as in diagram 18, but that is wrong. Referring again to diagram 20, where the observations are illustrated in the proper order as they were actually taken, and all in accordance with the theories of Copernican astronomy, we find that the angle of Mars is to the eastward, outside of the two perpendiculars. This is more simply shown in diagram 19, A being the first observation on the right and C the second observation on the left. That is correct. Starting as we did with Mars on the perpendicular at A, we know that whenever we shall see it again, it must be to the eastward of the star which marks that perpendicular, because while the star remains fixed in space, the planet is moving every hour along its orbit to the eastward round the sun, and so, when we see it from C the next morning, it is as we have shown in diagrams 19 and 20. It has moved from the line AX to a position a little further east in universal space than the line CX. Whatever displacement there is outside the two perpendiculars, so that the second line of sight to Mars diverges from the first. Consequently, no triangulation occurs, and nothing of any material value is accomplished. The so-called angle of parallax was a displacement due to a real movement of the planet during the night. In conclusion, as AX and CX are one and the same perpendicular, and no angle, either real or apparent, occurs between them, the first observation AX and the baseline are entirely without value, and may be discarded as useless. Diagram 21. This leaves us with only the perpendicular CX and the second observation, which proves to be a narrow inverted triangle, CX Mars, where the displacement of the planet XM, hitherto known as the parallax of Mars, indicates how much the planet has moved to the left of the star during the night, while the observer at C is at the apex. Just that, and no more. Chapter 9. The Transit of Venus and the Distance to the Sun. Not content with the work already done, all the world of astronomy set out to try and measure the distance to the Sun again in the years 1874 and 1882 by observations of the transit of Venus. It was a most elaborate affair. 'Tis said to be by far the greatest and most costly business ever undertaken for the purposes of astronomy. Men were trained specially for the work, equipped with all the most expensive things in the way of telescopes and instruments, and sent out by the British, French, and German governments, all allied for the purpose, as expeditions of astronomers to all parts of the world in order to see Venus, like a small speck, pass across the face of the sun. We have it on the best of authorities that the 1874 transit was a failure, but nothing daunted, the expeditions went out again in 1882 to the Indies, the antipodes and the polar regions, but again the results are admitted to be unsatisfactory, though we may at least hope the astronomers found some entertainment by the way. The Venus method has already been explained in an earlier chapter and illustrated in diagram 10. It required that the observations should be taken simultaneously by two observers placed as widely apart as possible in order to have the longest baseline obtainable, the ideal baseline being the entire diameter of the Earth. From among a large number of observations taken in different parts of the world, two were selected as being better than the rest. They were the observations taken at Bermuda, those lovely little islands near the West Indies, and Sabrina Land, on the edge of the icy Antarctic regions, and from this pair the distance of the sun was computed, but the result obtained has never been considered good enough to take the place of the earlier figures of Gill. We will give it the coup de grace in a short order. Bermuda is situated in 32 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 64 degrees 50 west longitude, while Sabrina Land is 67 degrees south and 120 degrees east of Greenwich. We must also mention that the fact that both the Sun and Venus were somewhere between these places in the eastern hemisphere. These commonplace facts alone prove that the two observations were not taken at the same time, and consequently were useless for the purpose. I will explain how that is. In their endeavor to secure the longest possible baseline, our astronomers separated themselves by 99 degrees in the north and south direction, and by 184 degrees east and west, so it is perfectly plain that the sun had already set to the observer at Sabrina Land before the observer at Bermuda could see it rise above his horizon at dawn. NB, the sun rises and sets at a distance of 90 degrees from the observer, so that the transit astronomers should not have been more than 180 degrees apart if they had wished to see the sun on the horizon, but our observers had exceeded the limit by nearly 5 degrees. See diagram 22. The two horizons diverge from each other, and for some part of the time the sun is between them, and not visible to either observer, while as it must be above each of the observer's horizons in turn in order to be seen at all. It is ridiculous to imagine that any observations taken by B and S in a direction toward the top of this page and above their horizons could ever meet anywhere in the universe. The whole business was a fiasco. All of the various methods of estimating the distance of the sun, that by means of the measurement to Mars, is by far the most important, while the second in order of merit is the one we have just dealt with. The computation by the transit of Venus, which, it will be remembered, was first used by Encke back in 1824. But there are, no doubt, many adherents of astronomy who will still hope to save the time-honored dogma which hangs upon the question of the distance to the sun, too egotistical to admit that they could have been mistaken, or too old-fashioned to accept new truths. And so, while they cannot any longer defend the Mars and Venus illusions, they will say that they know the sun is 93 million miles away because it has been estimated and verified by quite a number of other methods, with always the same result, or thereabouts. In these circumstances, it becomes necessary for us to touch upon these also. The brief examination we shall give to them will be illuminating, and astronomers will probably be surprised in one way, while the layman will be surprised in another. There are some things which every man or woman of ordinary intelligence knows are nonsensical, but when such things have been permitted to pose for generations as scientific knowledge, it is not sufficient to merely say that they are absurd. They must, for the moment, be treated as seriously as though they really were the scientific concepts they are supposed to be, and it must be shown just how and why and where they are absurd. Then, when that is done, they can masquerade no more, and will no longer obstruct the road to knowledge. Any one of these means of estimating the sun's distance might be made the subject of a lengthy argument, for they are like half-truths, which, as we well know, are harder to deal with than downright falsehood. But I do not wish to worry the reader with any more words than I am compelled to use, and so will deal with them as briefly as possible. Every one of these things which are believed to be methods of computing the distance to the sun, or means of verifying the 93 million mile estimate, presumes the distance of the sun to be already known, and in every case the method is the result of deductions from the figure 93 million miles. I am not particularly concerned as to how or why this was done, nor is it my affair whether it seems incredible or not, but I do know that this is as I have stated, and that I am very well able to prove it. I am only interested in knowing the truth, and in proving it by reason and fact. The verification of the sun's distance by the measurements to the minor planets Victoria, Iris, and Sappho in 1888 and 1889 was done in the same manner as the measurement to Mars, and fails in precisely the same way, by the fallacy of Dr. Halley's diurnal method of measurement by parallax. There is the calculation of the sun's distance by the so-called nodes of the moon, which is not necessary for me to dilate upon, because it has already been discredited and is not considered of any value by the authorities on astronomy themselves. The computation of the distance to the sun by the aberration of light is based upon the theory that the Earth travels along its orbit at the velocity of 18.64 miles per second. This velocity of the Earth is the speed at which it is supposed to be traveling along an orbit round the sun, 18.64 miles per second, 66,000 miles an hour, 1.584 million miles a day, or 584 million miles a year. The last of these figures is the circumference of the orbit, half of whose diameter, the radius, is of course the distance to the sun itself, and it is from this, pardon the necessary repetition, distance of the sun, first calculated by Encke in 1824 and later by Gill in 1877, that the whole of the figures, including the alleged so-called velocity of the Earth at 18.64 miles a second, were deduced. The 18.64 miles is wrong because the 93 million miles is wrong, because neither Encke nor Gill obtained any measurement of the sun's distance whatsoever, and the whole affair is nothing more than a playful piece of arithmetic, where the distance of the sun is first presumed to be known. From that, the velocity of the Earth per second is worked out by simple division, and then the result is worked up again by multiplication to the original figure, 93 million. And the astronomer then says that it is the distance to the sun. That is why it is absurd. The estimation of the distance of the sun by the masses of the planets depends upon the size, weight, volume, or masses of the planets, which depend upon their distance, and the distances of the planets were calculated by Kepler's, Newton's, and Bode's laws from Sir David Gill's attempt to measure the distance of Mars. Wherefore, as we have discovered that he did not find the distance to Mars, all the calculations which are founded upon his entirely erroneous conception of the distance, size, and mass of that planet go by the board. It will not do for anyone to say to us that the distance to Mars is 35 million miles, when in opposition, and therefore it must be 4,200 miles in diameter. Therefore, the distance of the sun must be 93 million miles, therefore its diameter must be 875,000 miles, and its mass 1.3 million times greater than the mass of the Earth, or 3 million times greater than Mars, etc., 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 and therefore it must be 93 million miles away. It is neither good logic, good mathematics, nor good sense. If anyone seeks to show that the distance from the Earth to the sun can be measured by weighing the sun and the planets, let him do his weighing first, and not assume anything, and he would do well to remember that the sun's distance is the indispensable link which connects terrestrial measures with all celestial ones. Finally, the sun's distance as 93 million miles is said to be justified by the velocity of light. The velocity of light was measured by an arrangement of wheels and revolving mirrors in the year 1882 at the Washington Monument, USA, and calculated to be 186,414 miles per second. N.B. Experiments had been made on several previous occasions with somewhat similar results, but Professor Newcomb's result obtained in 1882 is the accepted figure. Taking up on this figure, astronomers recalled that in the 17th century, Ole Romer had conceived the hypothesis that they took nearly 8.5 minutes to travel from the sun to the Earth, and so they multiplied his 8.25 minutes by Newcomb's 186,414, and said, in effect, there you are again, the distance of the sun is 93 million miles. It is so simple, but we are not so simple as to believe it, for we have shown in diagram 4 how Ole Romer deduced that 8.25 minute hypothesis from a mistaken idea of the cause of the difference in the times of the eclipses of Jupiter's satellites, and we know that there is no evidence in the world to show that light takes 8.25 minutes to come from the sun to the Earth. So the altogether erroneous and misconceived hypothesis of Ole Romer cannot be admitted as any kind of evidence and used in conjunction with the calculation of the velocity of light as an argument in favor of the ridiculous idea that the sun is 93 or any other number of millions of miles from this world of ours. All the extraordinary means used by astronomers have failed to discover the real distance of the sun, and the many attempts that have been made have achieved no more result than if they had never been done. That is to say, that it is not to be supposed that they may perhaps be somewhere near the mark, but it is also to be understood in the most literal sense of the word that the astronomers of today have no more knowledge of the sun's real distance than Adam. Indeed, we have to forget all of the romantic things that have been said since the time of Copernicus, and look at the universe as frankly and as fearlessly as he did. Then we might acknowledge the debt we owe to such as he, For even though he was so greatly in error, his originality stimulated the world of thought tremendously, and in that way furthered the world's progress, and then, tutored and encouraged by the shades of Hipparchus, Ptolemy, and Copernicus, Kepler and Newton and all their kind, we might, with the added experience and advantage of our times, rebuild the science of astronomy as they would do it now, true to the facts of nature. Chapter 10. The Birth of a New Astronomy. It is for me now to show how the distance to the sun is really to be ascertained, and this may indicate the way to a new astronomy and a saner conception of the universe. Diagram 23. The Copernican astronomy has been so hedged about with specious theories that it would seem to be impossible to obtain any kind of triangulation to the heavenly bodies that cannot be negatived by perpendicularity, geocentric parallax, or similar theories. Nevertheless, it can be done, and that by two simultaneous observations taken from a baseline which is on solid Earth. Thus, let two observers be placed on the same meridian, A, in the northern hemisphere, at about Mansfield, Nova Scotia, for example, 60 degrees north, 74 degrees west, and B, in the southern hemisphere, at Tierra del Fuego, Cape Horn, 55 degrees south, 74 degrees west, as shown in diagram 23. As the two observers are on the same meridian line, they use the same north and south, while all lines which cross that meridian line at right angles indicate east and west, and are parallel to each other, so that A's east is parallel to B's, and to the equator, as in diagram 24. The chord, that is a straight line connecting the 2 points of observation A, B, will give them a baseline of 6,900 miles in length, which runs in a direction due north and south, as in diagram 25. The two observers will find their easts by the compass, when it will be seen that they form two right angles to the baseline. The two easts with the baseline make a sort of frame, or three sides of a square, and it is within this frame, between the two dotted lines running east, that the triangulation will be made to the sun. Now let our observers take their places at about 8 o'clock local time, 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, on a morning within a week or so of Christmas. The sun will at that time be in the zenith, and almost exactly overhead at the island of St. Helena, off of the coast of South Africa. The observer at A in Nova Scotia will see the sun, blood red, just rising above the horizon to his east-southeast, while the observer at Tierra del Fuego will see the sun at the same time, about 8 degrees to the northward of his east by north, and so the two lines of sight from A and B converge so as to meet at the sun, which is between the two easts, a little to the southward of A and to the northward of B. A true triangulation is thus obtained, and the two angles may be referred either to the parallel easts or to the baseline which connects them. No allowances of any other kind whatsoever are to be made, and none of the fantastic theories of astronomy are in any way concerned. It is a plain, ordinary, common-sense triangulation, such as any surveyor would make if we were buying a piece of land, and that is good enough for us. The angles at the baseline will equal about 148 degrees, while the angle at the sun or apex of the triangle will be 32 degrees approximately. When these are multiplied into the baseline by ordinary trig, the sun will prove to be about 13,000 miles in a B line from A and 10,000 miles from B. The stars and planets are to be measured in a similar manner, when it will be found that no star is at any time further than 20,000 miles away. As it is my intention to deal more fully with such measurements in another book, sequel to this, devoted to the reconstruction, or rather to the creation of a new astronomy, I have been content here to say only sufficient to establish my case, and to show that Hipparchus was mistaken when he thought the heavenly bodies were infinitely distant. And that truly is my case, For at last I have shown that the infinitely distant hypothesis, which has been the guiding star of astronomers for 2,000 years, was indeed an error. Chapter 11. The Earth Stands Still. It would seem that Copernican astronomy had reached its highest development about the year 1882, and then began to decline, or rather to fall to pieces. The first evidence of this de-evolution is to be found in the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887 at Chicago, the result of which might have undeceived even the most devoted believer in the theory of a spinning Earth. Professor Michelson was one of the physicists foremost in determining the velocity of light. While he has recently been described in the New York Times as America's greatest physicist, and it was he who, working in collaboration with Morley in the 1887, made the most painstaking experiments by means of rays of light for the purpose of testing, verifying, or proving by physical science what really was the velocity of the Earth. To express this more clearly, astronomers have for a very long time stated that the Earth travels round the Sun with a speed of more than 18 miles a second, or 66,000 miles an hour. Without in any way seeking to deny this statement, but really believing it to be thereabouts correct, Michelson and Morley undertook their experiments in order to put it to a practical test, just in the same way as we might say, the green grocer has sent us a sack of potatoes which is said to contain 112 pounds of weight. We will weigh it ourselves to see if that is correct. More technically, the experiment was to test what was the velocity with which the Earth moved in its orbit round the Sun relative to the ether. A very well illustrated account of that experiment will be found in The Sphere, published in London, June 11, 1921, and it is from that article I quote the following verbatim. Quote, "But to the experimenter's surprise, no difference was discernible. The experiment was tried through numerous angles, but the motion through the ether was nil." End quote. Observe that the means employed represented the best that modern physical science could do to prove the movement of the Earth through the ethereal space, and the result showed that the Earth did not move at all. Quote, "The motion through the ether was nil." End quote. But the world of astronomy has not accepted that result, for it continues to preach the old dogma. It appears that they are willing to accept the decisions of physicists when it suits their case, but reject them when otherwise. And so they still maintain the fabulous theory that the Earth is rushing through space at 1,100 miles a minute, which, as they would say in America, surely is some traveling. It must be faster than a bullet from a Louis gun. What I have now to record, I do with regret, and only because my sense of duty in the pursuit of truth compels me. It is the circumstance that Sir George Airy, who retired from his position as Astronomer Royal in 1881, related some 9 years later how he had for some time been harassed by a suspicion that certain errors had crept into some of the computations published in 1866, and that, though he had set himself seriously to the work of revision, his powers were no longer what they had been, and he was never able to examine sufficiently into the work. Then he spoke of a grievous error that had been committed in one of the first steps, and pathetically added, quote, "My spirit in the work was broken, and I have never heartily proceeded with it since." End quote. My sympathy goes out to Sir George in his tribulation of the spirit due to advancing age, while I am not unmindful of myself, for I realize that in him I have lost one who would have been a friend, who would have listened when I said that all was not as it should be with the science of astronomy, and stood by my side, encouraging and helping when I, younger and stronger, strove to put it right. I do not know whether Sir George Airy was influenced or not by the result of the Michelson-Morley experiment, but it is at least a noteworthy coincidence that he made those comments only 3 years later. But in any case, science has need of him, and of such evident open-mindedness and sincerity as his, now. Not content to believe that the Earth did not move, further experiments were carried out by Nordmeyer in the year 1903 to test the Earth's velocity in relation to the intensities of light from the heavenly bodies, but he also failed to discover any movement. Even then, astronomers were determined to hold on to their ancient theories and deny the facts which had been twice demonstrated by the best means known to modern physical science. They preferred to believe the theory that the Earth was gyrating around the sun with the velocity of a Big Bertha shell, and tried to account for the physicists' failure to discover its movement by finding fault with the ether. It is not only difficult to understand why they should prefer theory to fact in this manner, and so deceive themselves, but it is strange also that the world in general could tolerate such nonsense. However, the results of several years' speculations concerning ether and space were set forth in the year 1911 in a series of lectures by Professor Ornoff, Upensky, and Mingelsky at Petrograd. It was suggested that light was not permitted to come from the stars to the Earth in a straight line because some quality in ethereal space caused it to follow the Earth as it moved round the orbit, and that might account for the failure of the experiments of 1887 and of 1903. In other words, it was suggested that we cannot see straight, or that the image of the star as we see it twinkling there is coming to us in a curve, following the Earth like a searchlight, while it describes the 5 terrestrial motions ascribed to it by Newton. When stated even more plainly, it means that when we think we see a star overhead, we're mistaken, for that is merely the end of a ray of light coming to us from a star which, in the material body, may be 1,000,000 miles to the right of us, or it may even be behind us, as in diagram 26. NB. A much greater curvature than we have illustrated in this diagram has since been suggested in all seriousness by leading astronomers from the platform of the Royal Astronomical Society at Burlington House, November 6, 1919, in these words, quote, "All lines were curved, and if they traveled far enough, they would regain at the starting point." End quote. Moreover, Orloff, Onspensky, and Mingelsky had come to the conclusion that nothing was fixed in the universe, so that while the moon goes round the Earth, and the Earth goes round the sun itself is moving with probably a downward tendency, carrying the whole Copernican solar system with it. Further, even the stars themselves have left their moorings, so that the entire visible universe is drifting, no one knows where. In brief, these Petrograd lectures of 1911 introduced many new ideas, such as those which have become familiar to the reader in Einstein's theory of relativity since the year following the Great World War. Chapter 12. Relativity. The theory of relativity is so complicated that when it first came to the public notice, it was said that there were probably not more than 12 people in the world capable of understanding it. But public interest was aroused, partly by the novelty of Einstein's hypothesis, and partly by the spectacular manner in which it has been received by the British Royal Astronomical Society on the night of November 6, 1919, until Mr. Eugene Higgins of the USA offered a prize of $5,000 for the best explanation of relativity in the form of an essay, describing it so that the general public could understand what it was all about. The prize was won by Mr. L. Bolton, London, and his essay can be found in the Scientific American, New York and London, June 1921, and also in the Westminster Gazette, London, June 14, 1921. The editor of the Gazette found it necessary to remark when publishing the essay that, quote, "Our readers will probably agree that even when stated in its simplest form, it remains a tough proposition," end quote. That is just the trouble with it. It is about as far removed from ordinary fact and plain English as it is possible for anything to be. Indeed, it is so intangible that it may well be that Einstein can form a mental picture of it himself, while he is at the same time unable to convey its meaning to others through the medium of ordinary language. The thing is elusive, abounding in inference, suggestion, half-truth, and ambiguity, wherefore it follows that any discussion of it, such as we propose to enter upon, must of necessity be almost equally refined. It might seem tortuous to some readers, and yet be like a very entertaining game of chess to others, while it certainly will be useful to those who are willing to traverse the long and difficult labyrinth that leads to truth. Relativity is clever, but it belongs to the same category as Newton's law of gravitation and the Kant-Herschel-Laplace nebular hypothesis, in as far as it is a superfine effort of the imagination seeking to maintain an impossible theory of the universe in defiance of every fact against it. Let us see what we can do with it. First, we will let Professor Einstein himself tell us what he means by relativity in the words he used in the opening of his address at Princeton University, USA. Quote, "What we mean by relative motion in general sense is perfectly plain to everyone. If we think of a wagon moving along a street, we know that it is possible to speak of the wagon at rest and the street in motion, just as well as it is to speak of the wagon in motion and the street at rest. That, however, is a very special part of the ideas involved in the principle of relativity." That would be amusing if we read it in a comic paper, or if Mutt and Jeff had said it, but when Professor Einstein says it in a lecture at the Princeton University, we're expected not to laugh. That is the only difference. It is silly, but I may not dismiss the matter with that remark, and so I will answer quite seriously that it is only possible for me to speak of the street moving while the wagon remains still, and to believe it when I cast away all the experience of a lifetime and am no longer able to understand the evidence of my senses, which is insanity. Such self-deception as this is not reasoning. It is the negation of reason, which is the faculty of forming correct conclusions from things observed, judged by the light of experience. It is unworthy of our intelligence and a waste of our greatest gift. But that introduction serves very well to illustrate the kind of illusion that lies at the root of relativity. Throughout the whole of his theories, there is evidence that Einstein was thinking almost entirely of their application to astronomy, but it was inevitable that this should involve him with physics, so that he had to then engage upon a series of arguments intended to show his principles would work out on the plane of general science. The first may be said to be the motive that inspired him, while the second consists of complications and difficulties which he could not avoid. And when he suggested that the street might be moving while the wagon with its wheels revolving was standing still, he was asking us to imagine that, in a similar manner, the earth we stand upon might be moving while the stars that pass in the night sky stand still. It is a case of appeal, where Einstein appeals in the name of a convicted Copernican astronomy against the judgment of Michelson-Morley, Nordmeyer, physics, fact, experience, observation, and even reason. We, on the other hand, are counsel for the prosecution, judge, and jury. Under the general heading of relativity, Einstein includes an assortment of new ideas, each of which depends on another, and each of which contributes to support the whole. He says that there is no ether, and that light is a material thing which comes to us through empty space. Consequently, light has a weight, and therefore is subject to the laws of gravitation, so that the light coming from a star may bend under its own weight, or deviate from the straight line by the attraction of the sun, or of any other celestial body it has to pass in its journey to the observer on earth. In that case, it follows that no star is in reality where it appears to be, for it may be even as suggested in diagram 26. Consequently, the heavenly bodies may be much further away than they have hitherto been supposed to be, and every method which is based upon the geometry of Euclid and the triangulation of Hipparchus will fail to discover the distance to a star, because its real position is no longer known. Wherefore Einstein has invented a new kind of geometry in order to calculate the positions of the stars by what is nothing more or less than metaphysics. We have always been accustomed to measure things by the three dimensions of Euclid: length, breadth, and thickness, but Einstein, thinking of astronomy, says that time is a fourth dimension, and proposes that henceforth things should be measured on the understanding that they have four dimensions: length, breadth, time, and thickness. The introduction of time as a fourth proportion of things makes it necessary for him to invent a number of new terms, and also to change the names of some of those that we already know and commonly use. Thus, for example, space is changed to continuum, while a point is called an event. Time, as we have always understood it, no longer exists and is said to be a fourth dimension, while there are no such things as infinity or eternity in relativity. That is the case for Einstein. It is the essence of his relativity, clearly stated in plain English. The details of it represent an immense amount of labor, of refined character. The whole thing is very imaginative, and the work of an artiste in fine-spun reflections. Indeed, it is of that double-distilled intricacy which finds favor with those who like mental gymnastics and hair-splitting argument, and are fond of marvelous figures. But I can conceive that in the course of time this relative phantasmagoria might come to be regarded as science, and be taught as such to the children of the near future, and that is to be prevented only by dealing with it now, which I will do, though I grieve to give so much space to a matter which only calls for it because it is pernicious.